evening and welcome to El Oso Fumar Takes. This is our 282nd take, live from the Alec Bradley Lone Star studio of Azle, Texas. I'm your host, Barry Duplessis, as always, and I'm so proud, so pleased, and so privileged to be with you all tonight. This is going to be a fantastic show, a blast from the past. I'm so excited to have this gentleman back on my podcast, and we're going to be talking about all things, catching up, great things with him, but also talking about things in the past as well. It's been a long time since we've had this distinguished gentleman as part of the show, but we're going to make it worth everybody's while here, and I'm so excited to have him back. But before we get to formal introductions, we do have to thank the people that make this show possible. That, of course, is our sponsors, and tonight's show is sponsored by Drew Estate. Drew Estate is at it once again, announcing another freestyle live pack that they've sometimes been called mystery packs, and they offer a pretty unique pre-launch experience for consumers who wish to be deeply engaged in each of the new Drew Estate's new product releases. The exclusive packs introduced during the Freestyle Live Special Edition broadcast held last month have an MSRP value of about $40, but are actually worth way more. Each pack contains 3 mystery cigars without brand new identification, a sleek Freestyle Live high-quality torch lighter, cigar cutter, and a Freestyle Live leather strap keychain. In addition to these premium items, every event pack comes with a QR code and a live badge that's equipped with that specific item. That allows purchasers to enter a sweepstakes for a chance to win it. Pretty awesome prizes, actually. The grand prize is a luxury custom pool table that's valued over $11,000, and the first prize is a laptop valued over $4,000 as well. Additionally, 10 lucky entrants will win custom Subculture Studio ashtrays valued above $150 a piece. So fantastic stuff from Drew Estate as always. And the winner of these contests will actually be announced on March 14th, along with the new brand identification for the mystery cigars that are part of the packaging. So just to tune in just a little under a month from today, March 14th, on Drew Estate's Facebook page for Drew Estate Freestyle Live. Find out the new brand name cigar that they're bringing to market and find out who the lucky winners are for the fantastic prizes that they have available. So again, cheers to everyone out there. So welcome back. This is our 282nd take. And without further ado, it's my pleasure, my privilege, and my honor to welcome back Mr. Nick Jimenez of so many things, including the PanCon podcast, El Vecino Cigar Lounge, and much, much more, and Dade magazine as well. Nick, welcome back. How you doing, my friend?
Man, I can't remember the last time I was called a distinguished gentleman, much less one people were proud and privileged to be talking to. This is very exciting for me right now, so thanks for all of that.
Well, man, I really, gosh, man, I enjoyed so much, so many of our conversations, and having you back on the show. Gosh, it has been years, man. It's crazy how long it's been. But I'm so glad to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
No, thank you, man. Thank you. It's crazy, right? How long it's been. I'm sure that you've had a version of that experience with a lot of your other guests, but especially for me, having been away from cigars for a bit and then finding myself back in it, I've had a lot of those experiences where it's like, talking to somebody for the first time, and then you do the math. It's like, oh man, it's been 6-7 years. I don't know how long it's been. I forget when we did that last take, but it's been quite a while, and it's cool to be able to do it and have it feel like you haven't skipped a beat, which I think is the thing that pulls people back into cigars for sure.
Oh, absolutely, man. I think that's what brings us all together in the first place, man. It's just like this unbelievable community and everything like that. And like you said, it has. I find like I think you're absolutely right. I've had guests that it's been, it'll be a few years since I've had them on, and it doesn't feel like it at all.
Yeah.
Like you kind of like don't skip a beat, which is pretty crazy and stuff. So we're going to get into everything that's new with you and kind of catch up with you here in just a little bit. But we have a tradition here on the show that's this is how long it has been for you. We've been doing this tradition for a while, but we weren't doing this back the last time you were on here. I have a few cigars, and I always ask my guest what cigar they would like me to smoke. So I have a few cigars for you to choose from.
Wow.
And I just grabbed a mishmash actually, but of stuff. But here's what I got. So I've got my number one cigar of the year from this past year, the Gran Habano 20th anniversary, Capitolia 1. So here we go. I've got the my number one cigar from last year, the previous year, the Espinosa Box Press Crema Toro.
Okay.
Tatuaje Cabaguan,
Okay.
Romeo and Julieta, the Envy. I don't know if you've had a chance to smoke this cigar. Or Black Label Trading Company, the Bishop's Blend from last year.
Got it. Man, I'm not basing this on any knowledge of what you're into. I would like to be nice to you and, I don't know, try to pick something that I think is mostly your wheelhouse, but I can't do that. So I can't. It's been too long since I had a tatuaje, so I'm gonna let you have one for me.
Sounds good. The Tatuaje Cabaguan.
Yeah.
Sounds good. That will be my cigar. Fantastic. What are you smoking tonight?
I am smoking Aganorsa leaf aniversario corojo in Toro.
Nice.
That is one of my go-tos for a number of reasons. I love the cigar, but they're also we have a good relationship with them here at Vecino, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, and they've been supportive of PanCon podcast, which I'm sure we'll also talk about a little bit.
For sure, for sure. So yeah, I thought I'm gonna go ahead and light up my cigar and everything here. I know you've been away from cigars for a bit, but I mean, were you still enjoying them on occasion, or not as frequently, or were you
Oh,
still
for
pretty
sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I just to put a little bit of context around that. So I left Cigar Snob magazine, where I was the senior editor, in the beginning of 2020, and from then, of course, the world was about to turn upside down. I don't think any of us knew how upside down it was about to turn, and I was very sloppy with how generous I was with my Cigar Snob cigar stash. Everybody got cigars way too much and too frequently. But fortunately, uh, we part of why I had left was to give more time to PanCon podcast and some of these other projects that I was taking on, and we had some cigar sponsors. So I was smoking a lot of Aganorsa and a lot of Drew Estate through that period. But yeah, I never stopped smoking. Maybe not as heavily as I was when I was at Cigar Snob, but for sure I was smoking a good amount.
That's awesome, man. I think it's interesting. Like I've had some people that I've had the opportunity to interview, or just people that I know that have kind of stepped away from cigars for a bit. And they're still. I think that's what's really great about it. They're still smoking. Like
Oh yeah.
I think if anything, it's like when reps or anything leave like a company, it's almost they kind of, it allows them to take the handcuffs off a little bit, because then you see them smoking cigars still, but then they're like smoking other brands that they weren't associated with anymore. So it's like they finally get to smoke what they like, or something, or something that's not necessarily in that day in day out repertoire and everything like that. Of course, when you were with Cigar Snob, you didn't have any necessarily brand loyalty, so it was you got to smoke a lot of different stuff, just like I do, which is nice.
Yeah, and to be clear, I left Cigar Snob to pursue my own thing at a time the world was turned upside down. The reason I'm saying I smoked those cigars so heavily because they were sponsors was not as an expression of some sort of loyalty, although I do love those two companies. It was more because I was broke.
Yeah,
So I was
cigar strapped.
yeah, so I was smoking the cigars I got from our sponsors, which it was a convenient thing. I left Cigar Snob with uh, a stash of not all of this was from Cigar Snob things, but I probably had a little stockpile of, I don't know, 1,000-ish cigars, maybe a little less than that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is I'm sure there are lots of people out there that have way bigger stashes. I've just never hoarded cigars or treated cigars as a thing I was collecting. So I didn't have that mindset of like being more judicious with how I smoked them and who I gave them to. Really, that stash had built as a result of I'd typically got my fix at the office, and so whenever I came across cigars, I would sort of stow them away. I smoked the last of them, um, this past July, and it was the 10th anniversary of my picking it up at my first IPCPR. It was a La Gloria Cubana trunk show.
Oh wow.
With that with that like homogenized tobacco band.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the last of the stash that I
Oh wow.
smoked just last year, and so my whole Cigar Snob squirreled away cigar set is gone.
Blast from the past, man, with
Yeah.
the trunk show. Jeez, man, that's been that's crazy. Well, yeah, before we kind of get more into it a little bit here, Nick, just kind of going back a little bit anyways, and then kind of catching up with you in general. I was thinking about this today. Do you have a favorite snack food that's not like a name brand? Because like a lot of people get asked this question, they're like, oh, like M&Ms or Doritos or something like that that's kind of like name brand. But is there like a type of snack that's not like you're like brand loyal to? And I'll give you an example, like
Okay.
wasabi peas or just like honey roasted peanuts or something like that. That's just not like, not branded or something like that.
Yeah. So just like a type of snack, not a specific brand.
Yeah, a type of snack, not a specific
Yeah.
brand.
Well, I think this is a brand name, but I'm using it generically here. Spreading a little butter on a saltine is an underappreciated.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. Maybe that's really boring or weird or something, but
No, it's just
also
incredibly unique. I just didn't expect that to be coming. That's interesting. Okay.
Cuban crackers, same. A little butter on a Cuban cracker is a great time, but saltines are more accessible all over the place, so I think that's maybe the more relatable answer there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could think of other answers, but maybe just because I've had that most recently, that
I
would be mine.
I used to do this all the time when I was a kid because we were broke, so like yeah, saltines were all the rage, man. But I couldn't when my parents couldn't buy tortilla chips all the time, so like that's how I made nachos. Because it was
Okay,
saltine crackers.
I don't think I've ever seen saltine crackers used in place of nachos. So you
Yeah.
like do the cheese and beans and stuff?
Yeah, or yeah, just mostly cheese and like, really, and here's the name brand, paste salsa or whatever that was just like really available in my parents' fridge, growing up.
I mean, dude, it that doesn't sound terrible. It
It's
sounds like
not.
you could do a
Yeah.
lot worse.
Yeah. No, it was freaking delicious, man. I mean, yeah. I mean, for a kid, for a hungry teenager, man. I mean, it was pretty baller. So,
Yeah.
um, butter and a salty. I didn't see that coming. Okay, fantastic. So you don't, because I don't really have a sweet tooth. Do you not have a sweet tooth?
I'll enjoy sweets, but I wouldn't describe myself as having a sweet tooth. If I had to name a sweet thing, like a really good chocolate chip cookie is great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but even that, I like them with like a really dark chocolate on the bitter side, maybe salted a little. Uh, so yeah, I'm not the sort of person who will go out of his way for a donut or ice cream. I can't remember the last time I had something really sweet like that.
I think we talked about this when we were in the DR together, actually. Because I think
Maybe.
I think they had something like really sweet, and like both you and I were just like, cool, thanks, but no thanks. Like we'll have a cup of coffee or something like that. So
Yeah, like I know
um,
dulce de leche is a thing a lot of people go bananas over, and if I never saw dulce de leche again, I'd be fine.
yeah,
You know.
there's worse things. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Well, let's get on to tonight's major point, which is always brought to you by the people. Yes, cigar people, the people who know everything about a lifetime service. Uh, Protocol Cigars is more than just pool parties and good times. Well, maybe it is. But behind the fun is a motivation for service, a motivation for giving back. From the original Protocol Blue to the latest release in the Lawman series, Phoebe Cousins, Protocol has always been about honor, passion, and yes, the people. It's what their life's work have been and always will be about. Power of the P, Protocol Cigars. So, Nick, I wanted to kind of go back here a little bit because it has been so long since you've been here on the show and everything. Just kind of do a little reintroduction. You kind of did a little bit at the top of the show. You were worked formerly with Cigar Snob magazine for a number of years. How long were you there? For quite a while, it felt like.
Yeah, I was there from almost exactly 10 years. I was there from 2013 to, I'm sorry, not 10 years, seven, from 2013 to 2020. And I started in, I believe it was March of 13 and left. Well, it might have been March of 2020. I know I like put in my notice in February, but I might have been there through the beginning of March. So about exactly 7 years.
Okay. Um, we're gonna go back to a story from 2012 that you were working on that I saw you post about a while ago. Well, not a while ago, in recent memory, but like, again, let's kind of start from the beginning. Like, what was your first experience with the cigar? Like, would you have did any relatives? I'll fill the audience back in with this. I mean, you're of Cuban descent, obviously. I know that, but like,
Sure, yeah.
what kind of led the to coming into the industry in the first place?
No, well, I mean, the industry would have been a little later. My first experience with cigars was right around my 18th birthday. I got as a gift from a good friend of mine. Um, it was a La Aurora Preferidos, the Ruby edition
Oh, nice.
in that like
Yeah,
Perfecto
the
tube
double perfecto.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was my first cigar. It was the stereotypical, a lot of coughing and a lot of coughs and regret. But kind of stuck with it. And I think that was 18th birthday. It might have been, maybe it was a year before. I forget. I think it was 18. And so yeah, I smoked from then on. I I guess it might surprise some people. Yeah, I grew up Cuban in Miami, but cigars were not really like a part of family gatherings for me. I do have some uncles and relatives who smoke cigars, but it wasn't really a thing in situations where I was around my family.
Hmm.
Um, I went to the University of Missouri, and during that time, I probably, uh, got more frequent with my cigar smoking, in part because there's not a whole lot to do in Columbia, Missouri, but also uh, because you leave wherever you're from and you want to connect to
In
where
the
you're from.
booming
And
town of Columbia, Missouri, you couldn't find
right,
anything better to do there, Nick, other than smoke cigars with your friends.
right,
It sounds
and I
weird.
mean, yeah, and I also wasn't the sort of person who, was into the things people relish about a college town experience, right? So I wasn't in a frat. I wasn't spending a lot of time in that kind of party scene. Um, and I also got like very heavily involved in my college years with Cuba related activism. Um, so anyway, during my time in college, I smoked a lot of cigars. I would smoke, over there. I'd smoke when I came back and saw friends here. And then after college, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin for a few years. And it was then that I was introduced by a mutual friend to Eric Calvino at Cigar Snob. I was a journalism major. I was looking for opportunities to do some, freelance writing, especially in those months where it was like too cold to do anything else in Wisconsin.
Hmm.
And so I started freelancing for Cigar Snob while I was living in Wisconsin. And then when the time came to move back to Miami, I got in touch with Eric, let him know that I'd be coming this way, and asked him to let me know if he knew of anybody who was hiring. And it turned out that he was looking for somebody to take on a lot of the editorial side of Cigar Snob's work. So I got into the industry with Cigar Snob. That was really my first exposure to the cigar business, outside of just being a casual smoker.
Okay. What were some of your go-tos back then, like cigars that you would frequent, like before you started
Um,
getting really introduced to a lot of brands and a lot of different cigars and stuff?
yeah, so I've always been big on Padron. Still I love a lot of cigars, but the way that I answer, like, what are your go-tos or what are your favorites, my true but also diplomatic answer to that is I won't pick a favorite, but if you told me you can only live in one corner of the humidor for the next 6 months, it's Padron. And that's been the case for a long time. But I smoked a lot of Hemingways since high school, in part because that same friend who gave me that first cigar as a gift, his dad was a big Hemingway guy, and we'd raid his humidor when I was over at his house a lot.
Nice.
So smoked a lot of Hemingways in high school and whenever I was back home from college. Um, and then when I was living in Wisconsin, the only place that I had within walking distance, because I didn't have a car while I was living there, because I lived like in a central enough area that I did most things on foot. Um, I would, I think I remember smoking a lot of Rocky Patel Edge at the time, just because like that was like the thing in that little cabinet humidor at the cigar bar. I think it was called Maduro, the bar, not the cigar. I think the bar was called. I don't think it's still there. It was a cool little spot, but I didn't have a huge selection. I liked, I enjoyed them. Not knocking anything, but it's not what I would have chosen if I, was in a place with a bigger selection in Madison, Wisconsin. But yeah, that's the long answer. The short answer is I've always been a Padron guy with lots of other stuff peppered in there.
Um, so what kind of got you into like the obviously again, like previously established, you're of Cuban descent. Like what was it about the Cuban activism? Because I mean, this is something you still keep up with today. I mean, this started back in college, like you said, but this has kind of been a lifelong passion
Yeah,
of yours. I mean, is it much more personal? Do you still have family there, and it's incredibly personal, or is it just going back to the fact that it's family roots?
yeah. I don't really have, at least not any family that I'm close enough to be aware of in Cuba. I'm sure I've got like distant relatives or something there. Um, but and I will say I was much more heavily involved in that stuff, in that kind of activism, when I was in college and in the years immediately following. Um, but no, I mean, what got me involved in it was uh, partly just feeling that family connection to Cuba. My mother's parents were born in Cuba. My dad was born in Cuba, um, and it just it scratched a few itches, right? So there's the personal cultural connection to the thing, but also uh, scratched a bit of a political itch too. I've always had a sort of libertarian streak in me, and so having a family tie to an island uh, that had been ravaged by just generations of dictatorship, uh, that was the place to channel some of that energy that felt the most natural and the most, call it, fulfilling. Um, it was also when I was in college. It was in a big part of it was probably that it was a way to sort of connect to that part of my roots that that I had, I don't want to say left behind, but that I had distance from, since they were my experience of it was in Miami, and I was now in Columbia, Missouri. Being in a place where there was so much less awareness of this thing that I had grown up hyper aware of all the time. My dad was also, and still is, sort of engaged in those issues and with organizations that do work in that, on that, in that space. So I would do, like, satisfy community service requirements at school, volunteering with organizations that did human rights advocacy stuff, and things to support political prisoners in Cuba and that sort of thing. So it had always been a part of my life in some way, shape, or form. And when I went off to college, I sort of dove all the way in.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I didn't know that your dad was involved with it too. Is it something that I mean, is it something that he's? I mean, how? I mean, the years of there's certainly been a lot of progress over certain years, and then there kind of was a roller coaster the last couple of years. Um, from 2016 until today. Um, but I mean, there's still just a lot of really great, of really great differences, obviously, between our two governments. But I mean, obviously, I mean, I don't want to read too much into Nick, but I've followed you for a long enough time. Your interest in the your, your interest in the country of Cuba has nothing to do with our geopolitical relationship. It has everything to do with the regime that's in place and the miscarriage of justice that's transpired over decades and generations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say no. I when I think of that issue, I don't really tend to think of the Cuban government's relationship to the U.S. government outside of the context of like any discussion about how policy might affect change. But the problem, uh, in my view, has very little to do with anything outside of Cuba. You know, if the the Cuban government would be no less a dictatorship if trade were changed or opened or closed all the way or whatever it might be. I would say my views on what U.S. policy ought to be have changed somewhat over. I mean, they've been the same for a while now, I think, but you know, over the period of time that we're discussing, where you know, sometime like immediately after high school and now, uh, I would say they've changed somewhat, but but those are not like core to my understanding of the issue or my interest in Cuba. You know, like the whatever activism I've been doing has really had very little to do with advocating for changes in one direction or the other on U.S. policy toward Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes it unclear, it's really more about you know, advocating for freedom and against the repression of the Cuban dictatorship.
I mean, if for anyone that's living under a rock and thinks that things have changed, you know, with the death of Castro and the regime there, it's you know, um, it's just simply not the case. And I thought something that where you could kind of bring some attention to it, Nick, and you posted it a couple weeks ago and everything, was a story that probably most people, including myself, if I hadn't followed you, probably would have missed. And apparently this was and my sincerest condolences, Nick, because this is a man that you knew, and Harold Sapero,
Right.
um, died about 3 weeks ago.
Hmm.
And
Sorry, no, he died much longer ago, but I forget what
oh,
the reason
died in
for.
2012. Correct. That's right. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. But you actually met him before this. So this goes back to how, like, your advocacy has
yeah,
gone back, you know, for quite a while and everything. Today, the 3 weeks ago would have been his 44th birthday. So
right, yeah,
obviously, this is still a story that is near and dear to your heart, of course. But share a little bit about Harold's life. I thought I'd give you the opportunity to kind of spotlight this, since and kind of give context to the oppression that still exists
yeah, sure.
on a topic that you're still very obviously involved with and very passionate about. So
Sure, yeah, and feel free to, you know, I'm trying to be measured with how much I talk, not because I don't want to touch on this or that, but I'm sure that being around cigars, you've experienced some of this. Like if you give a Cuban enough runway to talk about Cuba, they won't shut the fuck up. So, well, feel free to like, I don't know, wave your arms, give me
well,
the signal, like Nick,
I mean,
relax.
I'll guide the conversation with this. What was it like? What was it like meeting? You know, you met Harold before his death in 2012. What were so you? This was actually you actually had the opportunity to go to Cuba. What were you doing there? Was it a part of this activism? Was it part of journalism? Because
Yeah,
there were only
okay,
so many passes that were given out back then.
yeah. So okay, so I'll give a little bit of the setup so people kind of get what we're talking about here. So I graduated from high school in 2005. So I was at the University of Missouri from '05 to '09. In that time, I founded there was a network of student organizations. A lot of them shared the same name just because they kind of all latched onto the same catchy acronym. It was called CAUSA, CAUSA. And the full name was really just an excuse to get to the acronym. It was the Cuban American Undergraduate Student Association, but the acronym was Spanish for cause. So I started a CAUSA organization at the University of Missouri, and then that organization lived under the banner of a national volunteer group that was all university students and young professionals called Raíces de Esperanza, which was Spanish for roots of hope. So through having started this Causa group at the University of Missouri and attending a Roots of Hope conference, I end up in leadership and on the board of Roots of Hope. And in the course of that, end up making all sorts of connections and getting real deep into the Cuban human rights cause and activism and all of the rest of this. So between 2008 and 2009, I was in Cuba 4 times, if you count the 4th time when they turned me around at the airport in Havana and told me to get out of there and not come back. So
wow.
So what I
So
was
they didn't even
doing,
let you into this out of the airport. Like they just
correct, yeah, and I'll tell you that story because it's an interesting story that I think still is illustrative of how some things are today. So I went 4 times between 08 and 09. And the second time that I went, so every time I went at the time, it's still the case that to go to Cuba, your travel and the purposes of your travel has to fit within a certain set number of travel purposes, right? And that's any number of things. This is, like, as far as I can tell, rarely enforced anymore, but strictly speaking, it's supposed to be like these people-to-people trips, which is how a lot of people who you hear about or used to hear about going through travel agencies would get to Cuba, or academic research or missionary work, or there's a bunch of categories. One of the categories back then, you needed a license to travel specific to that trip and that category of travel. Or you could be traveling under some other organization's license. So for instance, at one time I had a license because I had found, after I graduated from college, I founded a nonprofit that never really got off the ground, but before it just fizzled, I had obtained a license from the Treasury Department to send X number of people to Cuba over the course of 12 months to do work related to this thing. So anyway, I traveled to Cuba under other organizations' licenses, and those licenses were for travel to Cuba for purposes of democracy promotion. So this is the one, if you go to see family or you're there on a missionary trip, you would generally like arrive, and if you had to show documentation of your permission from the US government to travel to Cuba, you would show this, and it would not be an issue on the Cuban side that you were there to do missionary work and that had been on paper. The democracy promotion license or travel purpose was the one thing that you wouldn't show up in Havana and be like, yeah, here it is. This is what I'm here for, Castro government. So when I went, I would have permission from the US government, but I would go through third countries and bribe passport stamp guys in Mexico and that sort of thing to every step of the way, in case I was being watched, make it look to the Cubans as though I were an American breaking embargo law. Can we curse on this show or
yeah,
no?
absolutely.
Okay, so
it sounds like a clusterfuck.
Yeah, the true story, the true thing, but also the sort of joke that I tell about this is that I was there to do all this democracy promotion stuff, but to make it look to the Cubans like it was something else, I would always travel and pack a lot of bathing suits and condoms to make it look like I was there to tan and fuck, and I was not doing very much of either of those at that age. I went 3 times. The second time that I went to Cuba, one of the things I was there to do was to meet with Harold Cepero and one of his very close friends, Roger Rubio, who is now in the U.S. He came to the U.S. not too long, maybe a couple of years, I think, after our meeting in Cuba. The two of them had been signatories of something called the Varela Project. So this was a signature collection initiative that was organized by Oswaldo Paya, who was the founder of something called the Christian Liberation Movement. The idea at the time was the Cuban Constitution had a provision in it that I'm sure they did not anticipate anybody actually making use of, that said X number of signatures, I'm blanking now what the number was, but if you have X number of signatures, a citizen initiative can put a bill or a legislation up for a vote in the National Assembly. So the Varela Project premise was we are going to use the Constitution against the government that created it and gather enough signatures to force the National Assembly to vote on democratic reforms in Cuba.
Okay.
The story is that Oswaldo Bayat takes these signatures over and over. They're turned away. Go fuck yourself. We're not going to vote on this. Get out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here. And what ends up happening is that all these very brave people who put their names to this thing end up in some stuff. Two of the people who signed that were Roger or Roget Rubio and Harold Cepero. Harold then later becomes the leader of the youth wing of the Christian liberation movement. So he's sort of like the youth, protege or right hand man of Oswaldo Paya. So fast forward, so I meet him.
And just to be clear, like this organization, like I mean, like just cutting through some of the fat here too, Nick, is like this organization. I mean, they are anti-Castro regime.
100%.
Yeah, they're. What type of government or what type of leadership were they looking? Were they looking to put democracy in place? What were they looking to do? What was their ultimate goal that they were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean the ultimate goal would have been not necessarily policy specifics in the way that you or I would talk about policy, but more like allowing for more than one political party to operate legally. And just
like free elections, like so like
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, like generic democratic reforms in the most generic sense of the term.
Okay.
That's what they were after. Now, Paya had his own, his own personal politics, but that wasn't really at play, except for maybe in the tactics, right? So the fact that he was a Christian Democrat and the thing was called Christian Liberation Movement informed a lot of their approach of nonviolence and all the rest of this, but it wasn't like they were calling for a Christian government, which I can see how maybe that being in the name of the organization would create a little confusion. So anyway, Harold and I meet Rohed, I meet Harold and Rohed with a couple of other friends that were there with me, and then not too long after, at the time, Rohed had just had a baby, and he was already in the process of looking to leave Cuba as a political refugee. The thinking being, it's one thing to be an activist of this kind when you don't have a kid. It's another thing to run the risk of leaving your kid fatherless because you're a political prisoner for however many years.
Right.
So he was like, I got to get out of here. Harold stayed behind. He stayed in Cuba. And fast forward to 2012, Harold Cepero and Oswaldo Paya are in a car with two Europeans. One of them was a Spanish legislator, and the other one was a diplomat from, I'm blanking now on what country. But the car is run off the road by Cuban state government agents, and Harold and Oswaldo both die in that crash. The Spanish legislator, who, if I'm not mistaken, was Angel Carromero. He, while he's in Cuba and hospitalized, gives a statement that it was all just an accident. It's not until he's safely back in Spain that he tells the Washington Post in an interview that story had been coerced out of him and that he'd been drugged during the time that he was given those statements. So,
wow.
Effectively, he comes out and says, "This was not an accident. I was in one of the. I forget if he was driving or if he was in the front passenger seat, but like I was in this car. We were run off the road. This was not like a random swerving to miss a pothole and hitting a tree situation." So Harold and Oswaldo both die in that crash. Oswaldo's daughter, just in the interest of kind of like rounding out the thing, in case anybody's interested in what that legacy looks like now, her name is Rosa Maria Paya, Paya being Paya. And she is the founder of a group called Cuba Decide, or Cuba Decides, but Decide without an S at the end is the Spanish translation. And it's a similar idea, right? They're like pushing for democratic reforms in Cuba, and she is probably the single biggest name as far as like lobbying for those sorts of things before international bodies, whether it's like the U.S. Congress or the European Parliament and what have you. But Oswaldo was an internationally recognized activist. It wasn't like some, nobody in Cuba. He had actually won a Sakharov Prize from the European Parliament. He was, I could be wrong. I think maybe at some point he'd been nominated for a Nobel. Like he was about as big a deal as you could be, doing this kind of activism in the Cuban underground. He was a thing.
That's crazy. Here you are, this kid from graduating from University of Missouri,
Right.
thrust into I mean, at least in this hemisphere, I mean, it's probably one of the most highly contentious places.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's easily, it's a little bit like, whenever you get into these comparison conversations, it's a little bit like when you're debating MVP or who's the goats in a sport, right? Like who's the goat in basketball? Is it about longevity or where you were at your peak? Like I would argue, and it's not a contest. Cuba is the goat dictatorship in the hemisphere. They, if for no other reason, just in terms of like the intensity of the repression and the longevity, right? We're talking about like 1959 until now, and it's been basically the one family, So, so fast forward a little bit. The story that I was going to tell you about when they turned me away in the airport in Havana. So I arrive on a Mexicana Airlines flight. So this is a Mexican airline, and they everybody on my flight goes through, they get their passports checked and the whole thing and security check. And when I present my passport to the person at the airport in Havana, I'm asked to just like, oh, go wait in that corner back there. So I go and I wait. It was all very weird, like not the sort of thing that you would expect this procedure to look like in the US or in many other countries. When everybody else from my flight had gone through, they called me back over, they asked me a bunch of questions like, who are you? What do you do? Who are your parents? This and that and the other thing. What are you in Cuba for? I told them all the lies that I had prepared for why I was in Cuba. And my real purpose of going to Cuba was related to a big concert that was going to be happening in Cuba. And I was there specifically to coordinate and in whatever way I could aid independent journalists. And in Cuba, independent journalism, like outside of the structure of the communist government, is completely outside of the law. But I was there to like aid those efforts in whatever I could, in whatever way I could. Long story short, they tell me we're gonna put you back on the plane that brought you, and you're going back to Cancun. I asked why. What this lady tells me is, in Spanish, there's nobody here with the clearance to see why, but what I know shows up on my screen is you are not to be allowed to enter any part of the country. So follow me. So they walk me back to the same gate that I had deplaned from, put me back on this Mexican Airlines plane. Mind you, there's no boarding pass involved. There's no air marshal involved. I haven't been handcuffed. So like, if you're on a flight from like, I don't know, Toronto to wherever in the US to go back home, and you see that they've put somebody on your flight who is supposedly too dangerous to allow into the country, you're like, get me the hell off of this flight. I have no interest in being on this plane with this person that's too dangerous to allow into your country. I didn't say anything about it to the Mexican airline crew. When I landed in Cancun was when I asked them, like, hey, is there any record of the fact that I was on this plane at all? Like, they just kind of walked me over here and told me, get on. And this flight crew was like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. So there was no record that I was back in Cancun anywhere.
Oh, wow.
The reason I say this is relevant to the question of what Cuba's like now, because this was clearly a long time ago. This was 2009. Is that this is the cost of doing business in or with Cuba. To have access to that market is to agree to their terms for participation, and it means suspending a lot of norms, whether they are norms of security or morality or whatever it might be. We would be up in arms if we learned that Aer Lingus was just willy-nilly not keeping track of who they were flying over to New York City or something.
Mm.
But I was thrown on this plane to get sent out of Cuba back to Cancun. Mind you, I have seen with my own eyes a video from, and this isn't like to inflate my own sense of, super spydom or something. Especially at the time, I didn't see this as being such a huge deal. It was really more silly than anything that we were that I and
Well,
so
it's
many
a
other
little
people like
scary
me.
though, man. I mean that like again, like to your point, like was there any record of my being on this flight? I mean, they could have put you anywhere, and we've seen that with the Cuban government.
Sure.
I mean, they could have put
Yeah.
you in prison.
No, I mean, and I knew that full well going into it. Case in point, the first time I went to Cuba, the only people who knew I was in Cuba, other than people involved in this organization I was with, it was my dad. Like we had agreed actually to not tell my mom until I was
Oh
already
wow.
in Cuba, until I was already over there, just for fear that she might like do something to sabotage the trip and keep me from going and taking these and taking these risks. And then in the time that I was going to Cuba, nobody else knew that I had ever been. Like my closest friends didn't know, my other people in my family didn't know until after I was turned away in 2009. The thinking being like, okay, at this point, for people to know is not going to jeopardize future travel because I've clearly been blacklisted. Um, and I confirmed that I was on that blacklist and wouldn't be able to go to Cuba as recently as 2017.
Oh
So
wow.
I haven't bothered to check back in on that, but I don't have
How
any reason to think.
well, how'd you get in the other two times? You said this was the second time that you tried to go.
No, I was turned away the fourth time.
Oh,
So I
you
met
that is the
I
fourth time. Okay.
yeah, I met Harold the second time.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Oh,
was just kind of fast forward. Yeah. So this is why I haven't been back. I mean, I always knew when I was going that it was just a matter of time before, like, whether it was by pissing them off or just making them tired of following me around or whatever. Um but yeah, like I'm sure they knew a lot of what I was up to, and there was always some base level risk. If people are not familiar, I would say like if you want to kind of get familiar with what that risk can look like for a U.S. citizen, if you're, I would say look up the case of Alan Gross.
I remember you
And
posting about this.
yeah,
I
so
remember
Alan
this.
Gross, Alan Gross is sort of like a worst case scenario short of death. He was over there for many years. Had gone to deliver satellite phones to Jewish communities. The Cuban government, for the satellite phones to begin with, are not legal over there because you're facilitating communication outside of government infrastructure. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, he was in jail. He like lost. He looked like he had been a political prisoner for all of those years. Um, and I was aware of that case, and you know, it could have gone south. The sort of thing that you're more willing to, the sort of risk you're more willing to take when you're in your early 20s and a little dumb.
It's crazy. It's crazy, Nick. Well, I mean, hopefully sooner
And I'm
than
sorry,
later.
I'll note in case anybody is interested in digging a little deeper, or just in my words, I published Cigar Snob in 2015. We ran a story called Midnight in Havana. So if you want to get a little bit into some of that stuff, you can just run a Google search for Cigar Snob Midnight in Havana, and that should lead you to a story from back in 2015 that I wrote for the magazine.
That's great. Um, I'll be sure to get that link into the show notes, everybody. So that'll be good. That'll be provided for everybody. I I think that the interesting thing about all of this too, Nick, is just that like you said, it's still very much a very, very popular topic of discussion. But it's usually revolved around those two things. And in the grand scheme of things, those things don't really matter. The US Cuban, trade relationship has no bearing on the injustices that you're talking about. You just talked about a few, obviously. And then the other is cigars, right?
Right.
People want their Cuban rum, they want their Cuban cigars, and that's you know, um,
I tell people all the time, by the way, um, being at a Vecino has put me in more situations than I'd ever been in to talk about that subject as it relates to cigars. And mind you, I don't know what other people's approaches are. I'm very fortunate to be involved back in the cigar business with people who not only knew what they were signing up for, but are on the same page as me. So, you've been in cigar bars and cigar lounges, and you get the question all the time from people, especially who are not quite as familiar, maybe out of towners.
Yeah.
Do you have Cubans?
Do you
Why
have
don't you have
Cubans?
Cubans?
Yeah.
My answer every time is a dual answer. I tell them we don't have Cubans for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's just not possible legally. And number two, we wouldn't if we could, because fuck them. That's why. We didn't flee all these firing squads. We're not, on the streets marching in solidarity with people who are getting run off the road and killed just to send them money for some cigars. Regardless of what the quality control issues are or whatever, there is pinned the obnoxious tweet pinned to the top of my Twitter account is something to the effect of there is no such thing as the cigar good enough to justify transacting with a brutal dictatorship that feeds on forced labor. If Kim Jong-un was making the world's best rum, it wouldn't be in our back bar. And it doesn't matter how good a Cuban cigar is, it's just not worth transacting with a dictatorship that owns that monopoly.
I mean, Nick, you've been so involved with this for such a long time. I mean, do you think there's any hope for some of the drastic changes to take place in the next decade, 2 decades, ever? I mean,
yeah, I mean the longer it goes, the harder it is to imagine it being any different, right? I do think that at some point or another it changes in the same way that I'm sure people in the Soviet Union never thought that that things would change there, in the same way that I'm sure lots of people never thought the Iron Curtain would fall. What that looks like, I have no idea. I don't want to pretend that I have some kind of a crystal ball or whatever. But yeah, I do think I don't think that it stays this way forever. Nothing is forever. You just hope that you find some way to accelerate change, whether that's some kind of gradual change or whatever. And this is also part of why I don't think that the question of U.S. policy is particularly relevant, because of course there are people who want to see trade liberalized because they just don't think that there's anything to oppose. But there are plenty of people who, on both sides of the trade question, who earnestly believe that this or that approach would be more conducive to accelerating some kind of a democratic change. So so that's part of why. Sorry, I've got some Vecino guests who are saying goodbye to my dog Petey, who's the unpaid bouncer at the bar. No, it's all good.
Are you on a podcast?
Yeah, I'm being interviewed now for a podcast. Yeah, bye, Petey. Petey's way more popular here than I am. 100%. Yeah, so that's a big part of why I don't think that's a particularly relevant question. It's an interesting question, but it's not relevant to the question of what is the problem in Cuba? The problem in Cuba isn't these trade policies. There are lots of people who care just as deeply as I do who don't have the same position on Cuban cigars. I don't agree with them on that narrow question, but I wouldn't say that anybody who's smoking a Cuban doesn't give a shit about Cuban people. But that's my position is, there's no sense, especially a government monopoly like that. My approach to going to Cuba was always, because then people will point to what they see as maybe an inconsistency there. When I went to Cuba, I only went because I saw opportunities to go in ways where I felt like I was taking more from the dictatorship than I was leaving behind. And even now I try to squeeze more juice out of those trips, like, for example, by telling these stories about Harold and Osvaldo and Roger and any number of other people who I interacted with and who are the real sort of heroes of that whole situation.
You said the last time you checked was 2017. Do you think it's still you still think you'd be on the blacklist today?
I don't see any reason to think that that wouldn't be the case. So the way that I confirmed it in 2017 was at the time I was working for Cigar Snob. I was offered a job editing a magazine that I don't think is still around called Cuba Trade, and it was about trade with Cuba. So I was offered this position, and I had made it clear to these guys, like, listen, I think this could be cool for me to be the one guy, the managing editor at Cuba Trade, who's not on board with trade with Cuba. It could be interesting, but I'm putting these cards on the table. I'm not trying to like surprise you once I get my first paycheck, you know. And I also told them I'm not interested in this job unless I'm able to go to Cuba. So here's what we ought to do. I'm about to go on this long trip, but when I get back, give me a freelance assignment, pay for my travel to Cuba, and eat the cost if I'm not able to get in. But then we'll know whether I can go to Cuba. So I asked them to do that and to not run it by the Cubans. Sure enough, but while I was on my trip, I got an email from them saying that they had run my name by their contacts in Cuba and that they had been told that no, this guy's not going to be able to get into Cuba, and they moved on and hired somebody else. So,
oh gosh.
Which is, I mean, it would have just been a matter of time. If I had been able to get into Cuba one time, who's to say that then I wouldn't have been back on a blacklist after whatever silly counter-revolutionary things I was up to, because I wouldn't have just gone and like covered a, I don't know, sugar trade show or some shit. I would have gone and gotten myself into some kind of trouble, and it would have been a whole issue. So
2020 comes around, you know. And thanks for sharing all of that, Nick. I thought that was really interesting, that post about Harold, and I knew there would be some good backstory in there too. But fast forward to 2020, you decide to leave cigars.
I'm sorry if I may just, and I don't know whether I should be doing this because I know that it can be disruptive, but I see somebody commenting, no one real cigar smoker in the world has not smoked a Cuban cigar. It's part of the evolution of a cigar smoker. First of all, I don't know that I'd say that's true, because why should we isolate Cuba? Like, there are plenty of real cigar smokers in the world who haven't smoked all kinds of shit. That's fine. But I said you shouldn't transact with them. If you come across somebody who's stealing them from the factory, we're having a different conversation. I'm all for stealing from the dictatorship. If you're gonna if you want to buy your cigars on the black market from some dude you trust who's getting legit Cuban cigars stolen from the factory, keep it in the black market. Again, fuck them. Fuck them doesn't mean never smoke them. Fuck them just means confirm that it's not helping.
Nice. So fast forward to 2020, and you decide to leave the cigar industry, after a really strong tenure at Cigar Snob magazine, and pursue these other opportunities. You had the opportunity to help co-found your own magazine with Dade magazine, correct?
Yep.
And that's still going strong. And then also, I know it's hosted by someone else, but tell us a little bit about the PanCon podcast that you're so closely associated with too.
Yeah, so I had started a website, dademag.com, and the idea had been and remains for it to be a pretty broad web magazine. That I had a slightly different vision for at the beginning. I overestimated my capacity to myself produce a whole variety of different content. And so over time, the thing evolved a bit. And then in 2019, I started a podcast called PanCon Podcast. First word PAN, second word CON, and then podcast, which is Spanish for podcast sandwich.
PanCon for all of you white people out there.
Right, PanCon, not pumpkin, not panko, PanCon podcast. And that sort of became the cornerstone of the website. The host is my good friend, which actually we barely knew each other when we started it, but we became very close in the course of making PanCon podcast. Is Mike Beltran, who is the chef owner of Ariete Hospitality Group, ARIETE, the flagship restaurant by the same name. Ariete has a Michelin star and we've got 10 bars and restaurants in the company, all of them here in the Miami area. And so PanCon podcast became the cornerstone because my thinking had always been I didn't want the broader project of DadeMag.com to just be like my personal blog. I wanted there to be a lot of voices, and this was the opportunity I came across to make someone else's voice the center of one of the projects on this website. And we are now closing in on 150 episodes. We've had some periods of more and less regular production, but we shoot for publishing at least a few times a month. And the guest list, I think we're punching way above our weight as far as the guest list goes. Most of it has been in the food and beverage space. So we've had, of course, a lot of people in the Miami area, like Matt Kusher, who owns Kush Hospitality Group, Jose Mending, Norman Van Aken.
That was a great interview.
Yeah, Norman Van Aken is great. Norman Van Aken, for those who don't know, is just a legendary South Florida chef, somebody who sort of like defined how people saw this area and its food very early on, as regional cuisines were starting to develop around the country. So like at the time that people were starting to wrap their heads around like what Southwestern American food might be and what California cuisine was, he was the guy who, like in the late 80s, early 90s, was introducing people outside of the tropics to a mango, so all
Cuban food is not spicy. It's not all
sure,
Latin cuisine is not created the same. It's not created equal. So
exactly. And I know that nowadays some people get up in arms about this stuff, but he was not himself Cuban. He was a dude from small town Illinois who
that's beautiful.
Who made his way down. And he actually, God, I wish I could remember the name of the restaurant. Not that I ever would have gone. I'm too young to have been there while he was there, but he would play at what I believe was a barbecue spot in Key West at about the time that a then not very well known Jimmy Buffett was working that room.
Oh wow!
So yeah, he's a legend of South Florida cuisine. Super tight with the Emeril Lagasse's and all these sort of legendary chefs. So anyway, he was on the podcast. He's Mike's food, one of Mike's food mentors. But we've also had other people like Ed Reed has been on the podcast, who of course a lot of not just football fans, but in the last several years, a lot of cigar fans have been becoming more well acquainted with, and that's one of my favorite dudes that we've had on just as a guy. Ed's the best. We have had Jorge Mas, who's a founder of not the founder. He was chairman of Mastech, but also owns Inter Miami, our MLS franchise down here with David Beckham. We have Rosa Maria Paya, who's the activist I mentioned earlier, the daughter of Osvaldo Paya. We are scheduled...
you had her on the podcast. Okay,
I
need to catch that episode. That's fantastic.
I'll make sure to send you a link. Remind me if I don't get it to you. We're scheduled to record this week. You never know if things fall through, but we're scheduled to record with Robesi Ramirez, who won 2 gold boxing medals for Cuba and then defected and became featherweight champion of the world, a WBO champion. So a good variety. I would say like 60 to 70% of it is food and beverage industry people, but that's not always where the conversations go. We typically record at like 9 p.m. ish, so it's like the last thing in everybody's day, kind of like this, and everybody's just been through very often like both sides of the interview have been through grueling kitchen shifts, and so by the time we're done, everybody is just sloppy drunk, and it's a very good time. Sometimes it gets a little heavier, like the episode we just put out with Lucy Lopez, who was a big radio personality here in Miami and now has a couple of podcasts herself. She and Mike talking about their experiences with their respective moms being diagnosed with cancer, and all of this leading up to a lot of talk about an event that's coming up. Mike, this will be the second year that Mike puts on an event called Cars and Croquetas, which is a charity car show to raise money for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. So all of this is to say, like, a lot of stuff happens on the podcast. It's kind of like wherever our heads are in the moment.
Yeah, I like that. Like it's dedicated to a space. I do something similar on the show, right? I mean, mostly it's all about cigars, but it's mostly about the people. But even like then, like I've had guests that we've brought on people to talk about movies, talk about baseball. So yeah, but I really like the podcast for that because again, it is kind of in the food and beverage world, like you said, but every so often you catch somebody like an Ed Reed or something like that, which you've had the opportunity to interview him twice because you interviewed him while you were on the Cigar Snob podcast, and then this was another project that you were a part of too, which is interesting. Do you so it's you produce it, correct? I mean, do you ever have the opportunity to co-host it much?
Yeah, so depending on who the guest is and what the topic is, I'll sort of insert myself more or less. I especially when the conversation is about food, I step way back because even more so when both Mike and the guest are chefs or restaurateurs or whatever. I have very little to contribute to that conversation. I was more involved in, for instance, the conversation with
like,
Jose Maria.
Yeah, man, your food's really good.
Yeah, it's pretty tasty. I've had it a bunch. No, but I was more involved in whenever we're talking Cuba or more recently we did an interview with Sherry Bayer, who is a food industry publicist and just published a book called Chef Wise. And we haven't put that episode out yet, but I'll insert myself a little more if we get into the topic of food journalism. And just because that's a little more connected to my wheelhouse and how media functions and what the role of journalists ought to be in talking about or reviewing a product. I think it's not that much of a leap to go from cigars to food when that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So it varies how involved I am in these conversations.
So when you kind of took a step back from the industry and we're focused here, like you said, and you kind of talked about it a little bit earlier and everything. And I think something you may have caught, and I want to bring the audience up to it just in case you happen. I cannot remember, just in case you said it before we went live or not. Did you ever see yourself coming back to the industry in a full time or at least majority time, opportunity, or like once you had the opportunity to move away and start Dade magazine and the working with this other podcast and Mike and everything like that, where you were like, I'm done. Like I that was something I did. I loved it. Eric's great. Cigar Snob magazine's amazing, but I'm kind of finished. Or was like, God, man, I really miss it. I want to come back.
Yeah, I mean, there were things about it that I missed, but I wouldn't say that I was seeking to be a part of it. I also had never written it off as like I'll never be involved again. But maybe to put it in clearer focus, I never got involved with Cigar Snob to begin with because of cigars. I got involved with Cigar Snob because it was a magazine opportunity. And it just so happened to be cigars, and that was how I became as acquainted with the industry as I, which is why, like, if you go back into the archives, I don't know how much of this stuff is accessible online, but especially at the very beginning in 2013, I wasn't writing all that much about the tobacco and the cigars in and of themselves, right? Which is something that I'm grateful to Eric and Cigar Snob for, because I think other people might see another warm body in the office and just assign them whatever the thing is that needs to get done. But he, I think, was very deliberate about making sure that I was getting exposure to the right stuff and the right people and the right experiences so that I could sort of, for lack of a better word, graduate to being sent off, on my own, unsupervised, to interview or to, for instance, I spent I don't know how many days with Aganorsa and on their farms and their factories and all that stuff to profile Eduardo and their company. Like by then, I'm not going to say that I'll never call myself an expert, because I think, as you know, there's too many of these old farts running around who've done nothing with their lives but learn about tobacco, and they're still learning. And if for no other reason than to avoid violence from them, I'm not going to call myself an expert on the record.
Right.
But I certainly knew more by year 7 than I did by year 1, and somewhere in between, Eric was watching and trusted me enough to take on stuff that I hadn't before.
Well, the unique opportunity that you had that I was, candidly was a little jealous of, professionally speaking, I wasn't like burning with envy or anything like that, but just because of the unique opportunity you had, because of the perspective you have, we were both down in the DR. We were hosted by Davidoff, and both yourself and Eric, myself and Coop had the opportunity to interview, I mean, a couple legends in the business, and Hanky Kellner, and Eladio Diaz. And we had, to boot for us, I mean, we had the king of translators. We had Klaus Kellner translating for you and I. And like the dumbass I am, of course, in my defense, I had just met you, but I was like, oh, who did Klaus translate for you? And you're like, well, Eric and I speak natively, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. And I was like, oh man. And like, yeah, I felt like a fool a little bit, but then I started thinking about that. I was like, man, what a freaking great opportunity that must have been for you, because like, as great as Klaus was at translating and everything, and to us to understand it, I mean, first of all, the comfortability that you had with your interviewee, and just like being able to catch a lot of the nuance that like I do when obviously I don't conduct interviews in Spanish on the show. I do it in English. Like there's a lot of times where like someone will say something and I'll be like, hey, wait, what was that? Like, let's kind of follow this train of thought. Like you had that ability to do. And so that's where I was kind of like, man, I bet that was so much fun. I'm sure you had dozens of opportunities like that, over your time with Cigar Snob, but I mean, I kind of wanted to go back to that moment, because for me, that was a personal moment for me, kind of, happy for you, and kind of like what did you learn that maybe I have missed or something?
Yeah, I don't know that I would have learned anything, to be honest, in that interview, which frankly, I don't remember super vividly. Like maybe there were little details or something that I caught that, thinking back, maybe you wouldn't have, but I think it was probably more about all the in-between stuff, So like, and to your point, I was always a little surprised, not that people who didn't speak Spanish would be interested and get into covering the industry, but that there weren't more native speakers on the media side. For whatever reason that might be, I really don't know. But I think that where being a native speaker helped was in 2 areas. Number one, developing some of those relationships, right? Because you're able to joke with somebody in their native language just while you're like, I don't know,
Yeah,
waiting
shoot
for
the
about
shit. Yeah, I mean, just like
right,
just normal conversation rather than like
right,
a formalized discussion of some kind.
right. But even also just like if you're walking a factory floor with one of these guys, you're able to catch like exactly what the interaction is between them and like when they, you know, interrupt something for quality control
Yeah, talk to
purposes,
a roller or something like
or
that. Yeah.
yeah, they give a roller feedback or whatever it might be. Like, so all of those things, I think in an interview context, especially when the person you're interviewing is sort of hyper aware that they're being, if not recorded, that it's on the record. It probably makes less of a difference there because they're being a little more measured and they're imagining all the words they're saying in quotes and all the rest of this. So I think that's probably where it made more of a difference.
Yeah.
But then the flip side of that is that, there are other people who maybe it's not that I wouldn't be able to connect with them, but that you could connect with, and in a way that some of these cigar makers couldn't connect with each other. So, like, I don't know how good Matt Booth's Spanish is, but God knows to talk to Matt Booth in English is
an adventure. Yeah.
Is an adventure. Like, I don't know that AJ Fernandez would have a full appreciation of what a sit down with Matt Booth is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So, and there's so much of that. Like, there's so many characters
Yeah.
in the industry that like
Yes.
it's an embarrassment of riches of characters, and to miss out on some of the people who speak no English, there's still a lot. There's still a lot going on.
Yeah. Um, Matt's one of my favorite people to interview. And it drives Coop crazy because I'm able to keep him contained is probably the best way I can do it.
Why
Is the best way
contain
to,
him? Why contain
I
him then?
well, I don't, and that's the thing that like, but he just doesn't like. I guess he just doesn't go as crazy with me as he goes with somebody else, and it's just because to your point, Dick, and this is what I've told Coop before. Is like I let him go, man, and then I just reel him back for whatever point that I want to make or whatever conversational or whatever topic I want to go down the road. But I just let him go because it's
Yeah.
he's incredible. I love him. He's and I have the opportunity to consider him a dear friend, and so it's really nice. So I mean, I bet that was really exciting for you to come back and kind of rekindle a lot of those relationships and maybe even introduce people too across some of these other networks that you've had.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this. So you had the opportunity um you had the opportunity to come back to the industry with El Vecino Cigar Lounge. So kind of walk us through like this and like where you're at now and how it kind of came to be.
Yeah, so PanCon podcast, as I mentioned, is hosted by Mike Beltran, who he's the chef owner of Arietta Hospitality Group. So chef owner meaning he's got a bunch of other partners who are not on the culinary side. And when the time came, by the time they decided that they wanted to open a cigar bar, I was, they had become well acquainted with me, and I had become well acquainted with them, and so we had a good sense of each other, and I think that it's a group where like we trust each other a lot, and so I think everybody saw a little bit of an opportunity. They saw an opportunity, at the risk of speaking for them, but I think they saw an opportunity to bring somebody in as a partner in this concept, El Vecino, who could fill the knowledge gap on the cigar side. And this is a group that does all of the other stuff involved in a cigar bar at a super high level. Like I, I'm. This should not be taken as me like patting myself on the back. I have nothing to do. Sorry, you want me to mute myself for these sirens here? I'm outside the bar. I don't know if
I
this is a
can't
big deal.
I can't
Okay,
even hear
cool,
him. So
perfect.
yeah.
Um, it's not me patting myself on the back here. It's just a fact. I think it's a fact that this is the only cigar bar in the country, or maybe anywhere, that is open to the public. So it's not members only. It's not like a room in a restaurant. This is the only one that is owned by a group that has a Michelin star under the same umbrella, right? So as far as like the hospitality side, whether it's the beverage side, the cocktail program, the food, the service, the design, like this is all at a super, super high level. It's something that I would not be able to accomplish if I were involved, if I were just like setting off on my own. Like suppose that I'd found an investor and wanted to open a cigar bar on my own, I would not be able to pull off what these guys have pulled off. So I have the easiest job in the building is just to kind of be a cigar guy and put cigars I like in the humidor. But
A dream job for most people, I would say. Like,
right,
and
yeah.
that smoke cigars. Like
Right. But the flip side of that is, I would not have become involved at all, right? Like they saw that opportunity with me to fill that knowledge gap so they could focus on that stuff. I absolutely would not have been involved with anybody else. Like I was not looking to get involved with a cigar bar, but that's the opportunity that this presented, right? Was to just be able to focus on that, to consult on that side of things, and to know with full confidence that no matter what was happening outside the humidor, the best move was to trust them with it. Like I have nothing to contribute on the cocktail menu or the recipes. We have a restaurant next door. Let me see if so right now El Vecino is at my back. All of this that you're looking at down that way, that's Brasserie Laurel, which is also part of the group. So we've got Brasserie Lorel supplies a menu of food that they make available exclusively to guests at El Vecino. So everything about the experience is stuff that like I'm really able to just sort of focus on the cigar side of it. And to your point, the sort of merging those networks is definitely, the thing that proved not just fun but very valuable, because I spent all this time a little bit like you, right? Like all of this time you've been developing very personal relationships with these people. And I've got friends in the business, and
Yeah.
now I was able to go to them, and there's a trust that we've built, because over the 7 years that I was at Cigar Snob, I wasn't buying anything from them and they weren't buying anything from me. I had nothing to do with ad sales at Cigar Snob. I was just the dude who was hanging out, writing stuff, and very happy to be forgotten. I wasn't trying to like build clout in the business or whatever. I just wanted to write cool stuff and see it printed in the magazine. And it helped also. There's a lot of overlap with PanCon podcast too, because some of the people who have like Drew Estate and Aganorsa, who are sponsors of the podcast, and both are in our humidor, I think saw the work that I did at Cigar Snob and appreciated the quality of it, and that has been valuable. There's a trust that's built there, that has gone a long way in this endeavor. So
Interesting. That's super cool about just being a part of a Michelin star organization. I mean, for me, that kind of nerd out on that shit because I freaking love food. So I love restaurants too.
you got to come down here, man. We'll have a whole we'll pig out together. Get
fantastic
food all up in get some Michelin star food all up in our beards.
Sounds good. I'm down. That's gonna happen at some point. What, just to kind of go back to this again, with you not looking for this opportunity necessarily, just landing in your lap. You also, frankly, with no retail experience, and like I was a part of that for a long time, and I can confidently say, I can confidently say this in two different directions, and this is going to seem like opposite sides of the spectrum. I am fully confident that at my peak, when I left the retail space, if someone had hired me to run a humidor, I could have done it with excellence. That being said, I know how fucking hard it is, and there's a lot of things that I would have probably fucked up on, to be completely frank and everything. So I mean, so there had to be some of that. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Nick, but there had to be some kind of intimidation factor with the fact that you didn't have any experience in this area other than just the knowledge and the relationships, which granted is a huge part of this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because of course there are aspects of that, right, that you got to be prepared for with some amount of experience and all that. But the flip side is, this is in terms of the approach, right? Like I think we're proud of the selection, and we know where we want to take it in the future. But this is it's a cigar bar first, right? And so that's part of why I took this opportunity. It's part of why, in the same way that like this is a company that on the restaurant side does not, especially at these like fine dining establishments that they have, the first priority is the product a fit for what we're trying to accomplish here. Not does it in terms of like the P&Ls, right? Which of course is important, but the concept comes first. So is this cigar a fit for the experience we want people to have here?
Right.
And that's part of what I mean by it's the easiest job in the building, because this is a company. Miami's food scene doesn't have the deep history that certain other places do, like New York or New Orleans or Austin or Chicago. So this is a company that's used to introducing people to a lot of things for the first time, and like letting Ariete be where you discover that you actually love foie gras and that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
So I was able to, like, a good example, and I hope that he won't mind that I'm saying this. But when, we have a pretty tight selection, and all of everything down to like every size was thought about very deliberately and whether it fit here. And we carry all of the Herrera Esteli lineup only in Lonsdale Deluxe. That's the only size we do. We don't carry it in any other sizes. And it's deliberate because I know that's the size that Willie blends to, and that's the experience we want people to have. And if you wanted a different size, I don't know, maybe at some point in the future we'll carry it, but right now that's the choice we made. And if you don't want to be taken for that ride, if you insist that you need all the sizes, that's okay. We're not a superstore. We never set out to be a superstore. And there's nothing wrong with a superstore, but we're attempting to curate a very particular experience and set of experiences here.
Well, yeah, Mike didn't hire you to run Smoke Inn, or as example, or a Corona Cigar Company, or a Two Guys Shop, or Michael's Tobacco, or anything like that. He like you said, it's very much it's part of the experience. Probably similar to the equivalent without the fine dining here in Fort Worth. There's the Silver Leaf, which is downtown Fort Worth, prime location. Beautiful establishment. It's an experience place. Like the humidor is pretty decent, mind you. But it's more about the experience, the cocktail, everything like that, and they do a great job with it. But yours is a whole world, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, and it's cool. Like it makes it a lot of fun, right? Because you're able to say like, all right, so we've got this cocktail. Is there something in the humidor that fits as a pairing for that? If somebody is really adamant about that or whatever, and and if it's not there, then we can go out and look for something and have it be very pinpointed in those directions. And the selection isn't right now where we have places that we want it to go. We're going to be expanding. We're bringing in new new suppliers and expanding the selection, but it's never I never ask anybody we're opening an account with, what's your best seller? I don't care. That's, it's not something we concern ourselves with.
Interesting.
Also bear in mind, this is a company, like, they can sell the experience. Like, they didn't get to have 10 bars and restaurants by creating experiences that confuse people and then not selling them. So it's a company that understands how to softly educate guests. I'll give you a good example. Probably the brand that has the most facings in our humidor, and it's not a massive selection, is Padron. We have a lot of people who come in here telling me that they don't smoke Maduros because Maduros are too strong.
Right.
Because this thing operates the way that it does, we're able to, whenever I'm here, I'll geek out with somebody, give them like a whole crash course situation on if they're down for it, on the process of growing and harvesting and processing tobacco. And sometimes I'll sit down at a table with somebody and we'll be dissecting cigars together. Actually, a Herrera Brazilian Maduro is my favorite cigar in our selection, to illustrate to people what what some Maduros can contribute to a blend, and especially when people are confused about, like, what do you mean Maduros take on a sort of sweetness? Like, what does that mean in real terms? So I'll very often take a Brazilian Maduro, Lonsdale, cut off about an inch of wrapper, and give it to somebody and let them smoke it as a sort of shaggy foot cigar, and tell them, like, make sure you're paying attention to how it changes when the wrapper starts burning. Because we're able to have these personal interactions with people, we have a number of guests who have come in saying, like, oh, I'm a Padron guy and I only smoke the Padron Naturals because the Maduros are too strong. And now they are like, Maduros are all they smoke. That's their thing. It's not a matter of like that one is better than the other, but if we want to make nerds out of people, or I want to make nerds out of people here, and if the focus is on making nerds out of people, those are the people who feel a connection to the product, to the craft, to the experience, if you're just burning tobacco, cigar smoking and burning tobacco are two different things. Some people think they're smoking cigars and they're just burning tobacco. But when you know about it, when the more you know about it, the more you fall in love with it. You know, and that's the experience that I'm sure you've had, that I've had. In fact, I remember traveling with Andy Astencio, who is still doing he's the art director at Cigar Snob. And the first time he traveled internationally, because he got his US citizenship, was on a well, I don't know if it was other than Cuba. The first time he traveled somewhere other than Cuba, I believe, was on a trip with me to the DR. And he had been editing or doing all of Cigar Snob's page design and smoking with us and all this stuff for years and years. And it wasn't until he was in the DR seeing a lot of this stuff right in front of him that he said, now I get it. Like, you can't be this close to it and not fall in love with it, you know? So, you know, does that mean you have to be on a farm or in a factory? Not necessarily, but the closer you can bring somebody to what they're actually experiencing, the more likely they are to fall in love.
Well, that's the unique perspective that you can bring to this experience. Like you said, like it's part of the experience, and people go in there to have the Michelin star meal, to have the signature cocktail, and to have a cigar. And then along the way, you know, you have these wave of experts that explain where the food is and blah, 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 and why that's special. And here's the cocktail and why that's special. And then you're that guy that can bring those stories like, hey, yeah, one time I was down in the Dominican Republic and I was talking to the guy who created this cigar, you know, and you can bring a little piece of that to the conversation, and it changes everything, I think.
Yeah. I think people just assume that the consumer, for lack of a better word, although I've been like trained that like we don't call them customers, they're guests, right? But the smoker doesn't want to be educated, and I think that's just not true.
That's not true. Yeah.
One of the best events that we've done here was, you've probably been through some version of the Aganorsa tasting with the three Fumas, or maybe you've seen it at a shop or something, maybe pictures. Like the Aganorsa team, they have these three Sorullos or three Fumas of just a single leaf rolled up, and it's three varietals that they use heavily in their blends. And we asked them to just supply us with those. And what we did was we built a whole experience around these, and the idea was you have the one Fuma, sorry, are you still there? You look like you froze.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I'm still here.
Okay, cool. Sorry. You're just very still.
Sorry. No, I'm in.
It's all good. Yeah. So what we did was we took a tasting that Aganorsa might sometimes do and keep it at like 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And we made it like a 3-hour ordeal, where with each Fuma, I would take people through this presentation. There was a slideshow and graphics and all kinds of shit about the whole process. And then you're smoking these things. And then one of the sommeliers in the company had sat with me and tasted all of these and found wine pairings for each one. And so you get the Fuma, you're poured a little bit of wine that pairs with it, the next one, and so on and so forth until fine. And each Fuma is paired with a snack from the kitchen next door at Brasserie Laurel. And you get people to have this whole experience where they're connecting with the tobacco in a totally different way. And all of a sudden, you've taken somebody from burning tobacco to smoking cigars.
There you go.
You know,
I love it.
And it's just a matter of making that connection. So all of this is, you know, I think we meandered here from the question of like how I have gone about stocking the humidor, and the answer is that it's easy because this company is so great at all these other things that I really am able to just focus on giving people that experience. And it's okay if it's not for everybody. It's okay if like somebody wants a particular size. You know, like I think the only 60 ring gauge thing we have in the humidor right now is the 3 blends of EPC's inch. You know, because we wanted to have something for that person, but I wanted to make sure that if somebody's smoking 60 ring gauge, it's something that was blended with 60 ring gauge in mind, or with 64 ring gauge in mind, with a big ring gauge in mind.
Yeah.
You know, and if that's, you know, if you're really into some other thing that we don't have, it's okay. Like we don't have to be everything to everybody.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is exciting stuff, Nick, and I really appreciate you sharing it. So, like for everybody out there, anyone visiting Miami, where can they find El Vecino? When what are their hours operation? When they can find you there? What just fill us all the details there.
Sure. So El Vecino is in downtown Miami. We are at 698 Northeast First Avenue, and that is about 2 blocks west of the Casella Center, where the Miami Heat play, just to get people, orient people a little bit. So pretty centrally located. If you happen to be in Orlando or anywhere south of there that is along the Brightline train route, you can take Brightline, and we are a couple of blocks from the Miami Brightline station in the other direction. So that's like the high-speed rail here that people are using, or the Orlando to Miami thing just opened a few months ago, I believe, maybe a few weeks ago.
Nice.
So you can find the website is elvecinomiami.com, ELVECINO Miami.com, and it's the same on the socials, El Vecino Miami on Instagram. Yeah, it's we're open at 4 p.m. every day. This is to give you an idea of, so we had been open earlier in the day before. We are in what's called Miami World Center. So Miami World Center is a 20 some odd acre development in the heart of Miami. And our cigar bar and the French restaurant next door that's in our group are the only food and beverage concepts open right now in Miami World Center. As this area starts to kind of come to life, like Maple and Ash is opening across the street. They're a steakhouse with locations in Chicago and Scottsdale. There's going to be a bowling alley. There's all kinds of stuff that's going to be happening in this little corner of the world.
That's cool.
So as it starts to kind of come to life a little more, and parking gets figured out and all that stuff, we'll be opening earlier and earlier in the day. But right now we're open 4 p.m. every day. We close at midnight on Sundays and Mondays, at 1 a.m. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday, Saturday, we close at 2 a.m. And then I would also note one thing that's sort of like, we're not this, and then I'll contradict a little bit. We're not a sports bar. We're not like come and watch, cable news. Like, this is a very much a cocktail bar vibe. In fact, if you wanted, I could, when we're done here, if you want, I can. It's not a huge space. I can take the laptop in there and give you a little first-person fly around or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much a cocktail bar feel. However, Mike and I are both fight fans, and so are some of the other partners like Andrew Falsetto. We're all fight fans, and so we've been doing the UFC pay-per-views. So every so often, if you want to come in and watch people get punched in the face, we turn into a little bit of a sports bar for those purposes.
There you go.
Nice. So nice. Let me know if you want to do that. I don't want to like impose.
Yeah, let's do it real quick while we before we transition to our fun segments and conclude the evening with our last few questions and stuff. So
cool.
Be fun.
I'll just hold the laptop in front of myself.
This is like only like the second time this has ever happened on our show.
Oh yeah, here I'm gonna turn you around. So actually, if you look down there, there's the arena off in the distance. You can barely make it out.
Okay.
And then here's the front of the place. We're gonna walk through here.
It's almost closing time, right?
It's almost closing time, yeah. So this is the bar.
And there's the humidor.
And there's the humidor. So, it's not a huge space. We got room for about 35, 40 people in here. And here is the humidor. And I anticipate the humidor setup changing pretty dramatically as we start to bring in other stuff. So I'm going to be transitioning a lot of things into trays, and I have all kinds of wild ideas about what exactly that setup would look like, that are probably unrealistic and overestimating my creativity and carpentry skills. But we'll see what I do with it.
Nice. That's exciting stuff, man. That's exciting stuff. I think that what's really exciting, just about these kinds of concepts and stuff is that I really like the fact that the other people are getting involved in the industry, and then they're able to bring in people like yourself that can kind of fill that gap. And like I said, they're just bringing that perspective and those unique opportunities and those relationships that we talked about, which we, like I said, is a very important part of it. So that's really exciting, and that looks beautiful. I can't wait to visit. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Oh, I would love
for
that.
sure. So yeah, go check out El Vecino, guys. It's in downtown Miami. So next time you're down in Miami, a lot of great cigar stuff to do. So there's a lot of great cigar destinations and everything. But this is a unique experience, and Nick's done a really good job of bringing in some really cool stuff and making it a part of the whole culture there. So this is really good stuff.
I would also note this isn't me. These aren't my words. A lot of our guests here insist that Laurel next door on their exclusive menu for El Vecino, that is maybe the best burger in Miami. Just throwing it out there.
Oh, that's a huge claim. All right. Does it have egg on it?
There's no egg.
Okay,
No.
Cool. Well, fantastic. That means we got to bring Coop there, because Coop's
the right
ultimate judge. He's the ultimate judge of burgers, so that's fantastic.
Okay, love it.
So great excuse to go down there. Perfect. I love it. Love it. That'll be happening for sure. So best burger in Miami. Whew, nice. Exciting stuff. How would you characterize the menu? You said French, correct?
Well, the restaurant next door is French. All of our food, all the food that is served at a Vecino comes from that kitchen. It's not all French. So to give you an example, so there's the burger, but it's a very classic American burger. There is a burger next door, but they change things up for our menu. There's also, it's a pet peeve of mine. The menu has an item that is called short rib pot pie, but there's no pie crust. It's really more of a short rib shepherd's pie, sort of very cheesy whipped potato with short rib, braised short rib underneath. But that's delicious. There's oysters, there's caviar, there's a poutine. So it's just a bunch of stuff that we thought would be delicious and that fit the vibe of not just the vibe of the cigar bar, but also like physically, how you're seated and all of that stuff. So for instance, the restaurant next door, Laurel, has a burger that is a very fork and knife burger. It's Gruyere cheese and shaved truffles and caramelized onions, and it's sitting in a bowl of like a peppery au poivre sauce, very Frenchified. That wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Sitting, like, cutting it over a coffee table. So, we needed to clean it up a little and just do a classic, you can hold it in your hands situation.
I'll eat that other burger at your place. I don't care. But yeah, that sounds fantastic though. But yeah, no, that's exciting. Really cool. Very cool concept, Mick. Well, thank you so much for kind of catching us up on everything and sharing a little bit about stuff we hadn't got into last time you were here, which was really, really great.
Thank you.
So we've got some fun segments to kind of conclude our evening and everything. So I wanted to go ahead and kick it off everything with our presidential trivia segment, which of course is brought to you by United Cigars, featuring La Gian Havana, distributors of Jose Dominguez, Bandolero, Garofalo, the Firecracker, and the highly acclaimed Atabey, Byron, and now Alfonso lines from Selected Tobacco. Smoke one today and start living united. I said there were going to be a series of questions, Nick. This is going to be multiple choice, so this is probably going to be the toughest one for you. But I think I picked an alley-oop for you, man. I think I really did to use them.
You might be overestimating me here. But
I tailor it to my guests a little bit. So this has to do with something you're very passionate about, which is the country of Cuba, right? So in 2016, President Barack Obama was the first sitting president to visit Cuba since this sitting president. Okay, so sitting president. So 2016, Barack Obama was the first sitting president to visit Cuba since this sitting president. So was it A, Ulysses S. Grant, B, Calvin Coolidge, C, Woodrow Wilson, or D, John F. Kennedy?
All right. Kennedy was not in Cuba.
Correct.
Grant, I do not believe went to Cuba.
He did actually after his presidency, believe it or not.
Well, yeah. Well, I didn't know that for a fact, but I think I felt like I would have known it if he'd been there as president. You said it was Coolidge and who else?
Coolidge and Wilson are the only two left on the board.
I'm gonna guess Wilson.
Oh man, it's Calvin Coolidge, 1928.
Damn. Okay. All right.
Yeah, 1928 was the last time that a sitting U.S. president had visited the country of Cuba, which is interesting that it's kind of dominated geopolitical conversation for more than half a century. And the last president was in the first half of the century to visit the country.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I thought about doing a Theodore Roosevelt Spanish-American War trivia question, but I was like, that seems a little tired. So I grabbed this little nugget, and I thought it was interesting though that that, like I said, the last sitting president was Coolidge of all people, which the visit actually wasn't even significant by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, at least comparatively speaking to the controversial topic that Cuba has been over, like I said, the last 50 years or so, which is crazy. So here's a question I wanted to ask, because I know we kind of passed on it, but I again, with your interest not necessarily in the geopolitical space of U.S. trade relations, do you think some of the strides that were made under the Obama administration helped or hurt the causes that would further, for lack of a better term, more freedom, politically speaking, in the country of Cuba, or do you think it actually did it a disservice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were things that happened during the administration. I think that there were developments, there were changes, just to the reality of people's lives that were on net good. The biggest among them expanded access to the internet. I don't know how much I would I don't know how different that would have played out had another president been in the White House at that time. So I don't know how much of that I would ascribe, how much of that positive change I would ascribe to Obama policy. I know that some Obama policy, contributed to that, but I think that was the internet just being such a critical component of the way of life of anyone in the world who can access it. I think Cuba was on a collision course with the internet. In that sense, I think, but let's just say that, because it happened around then, we can ascribe it to Obama policy. I would say that's, Cuba is better off with more internet than less internet access. Let me answer it this way. I think that the embargo, as currently constituted, doesn't make very much sense at all, right? I do think that Cuba, I find more compelling arguments that Cuba would be better off either with a legitimate embargo, where the regime was forced to actually account for the consequences of the scarcity that it imposes on its own people.
Yeah.
Rather than being able to use the buffer of other countries stepping in, and by the way, effectively stealing from other countries. That Cuba is able to buy from the U.S. on a cash upfront basis, or from U.S. firms on a cash upfront basis, is sort of unique, right? Like most places, you're extending some credit, but the people of Spain, for instance, have found themselves having to pay for the fact that Cuba doesn't pay its debts, that the Cuban government doesn't pay its debts. So you know, to open trade with this regime that operates in such an abnormal, perverse sort of way, I don't know. I think to me it's sort of an all or nothing thing. Either normalize it all the way, or treat the Cuban state like the pariah it deserves to be treated like, and force it to change in a way that is responsive to what its people are calling for. When all these protests in Cuba broke out in the summer of 2021, was it sparked by material need and energy shortages and what have you? Yes, but when people went out into the streets, what they were chanting was a broader diagnosis of their problem, which was they were chanting for freedom. They weren't chanting we want power. They weren't chanting we want better food rations. They were chanting we want freedom, because even the people of Cuba know that that's the core of the problem. So I think the more you give the Cuban government an out, the more they'll always take opportunities to open and close the freedom spigot just enough to keep themselves there.
Here's a question I didn't get to ask you last time because it actually hadn't happened. I mean, a very big thing happened since the last time we talked. Fidel Castro died.
Yep.
And the city of Miami, I mean, woke up and in a very organic and beautiful way, because like when things like that happen, I mean, people riot when their team wins the championship. It wasn't like that, and I mean, if there was ever an emotion, a hot button emotion to trigger people to go the wrong way in something like that, it would have been this. But it was a very beautiful and organic celebration. I mean, it's hard to celebrate death, but what it signaled to the years of oppression and the separation of families and the imprisonment of innocent people, and all the social injustice, all the discarding of human rights, civil rights. I mean, I don't mean to back you into a corner here, Nick. Were you on the streets with people? Like, were you celebrating with everybody? I mean, what was that like to at least be in the city when that was happening?
Yeah, I would say, and I'll explain the answer, but I would say yes and no. So the footage that you probably saw on TV or wherever was, you might have been to Versailles, the Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. Sure. So that's like the epicenter of any Cuban American street demonstration or protest in Miami. Sorry, Petey, what are you doing? And I was there. I was with somebody who really wanted to go. I wasn't particularly adamant about going, just because by then Fidel Castro had been out of power for long enough that it didn't really represent in my mind any real impending change. I think what you saw on the street, maybe like a good analogy, trying to think of what a good analogy would be like. I imagine a lot of people with the experience of being in North Korea would feel a sort of jubilation or jubilance. I'm not sure which of those is the appropriate word there. So the words are supposed to be my thing, but I'm not sure. If Kim Jong-un, at the death of Kim Jong-un. But I think that that's more of an emotional response to what you suffered under that person, in the same way that somebody might feel a catharsis if, I don't know, the person who like murdered their kid died, they hear they died in prison or something, right? But like by then the thing is past, and in this case, Kim Jong-il still around. Mm-hmm. He's still there, and that the thing has already outlived, even though he wasn't literally dead, the thing had outlived Fidel Castro. If anything, there was a sort of hope that because Fidel Castro was like the more charismatic of the two brothers. There was a sort of hope that with him would die like a powerful political tool. But again, by then he'd been out of it. He'd been out of the game. He was writing these so-called reflections in the Cuban press that nobody really believed he was writing. So anyway, I was on the street. I hesitate to say that I was celebrating just because it felt like a big deal historically. It didn't feel like a big deal in terms of like that it would have real consequences.
Yeah.
You know,
it wasn't, it wasn't like, Hitler's suicide or the, an assassination of like Stalin or anything like that.
I mean, case in point, in the summer of 2021, all these protests break out. And I see somebody saying, Cuba and North Korea not even close. I get it; they're two very different places. It's an analogy. We're just drawing comparisons. But in the summer of 2021, protests break out, and the Cuban government has since sentenced many people who were out on the streets protesting in Cuba to multi-year sentences. So is it North Korea? No, it's not North Korea. We can, draw comparisons, and North Korea is a whole other set of crazy. North Korea is also in large part worse because North Korea doesn't depend on tourism. Cuba has to maintain, for PR purposes, because it only survives because of the tourism industry. You've got to keep up appearances and not upset the wrong people and not let your image get too bad. But there are people serving long prison sentences today for protesting on the streets in the summer of 2021. When I was in Cuba in 2008, my first trip to Cuba, one of the people that I met with, and I mentioned this, I write about this a little bit in the Midnight in Havana story that I share with you, or that is on Cigar Snob's website. One of the people that I met was a guy who goes by the name Antunes, and he had just gotten out of prison after 17 years for giving a sort of speech during a demonstration in a public park about the UN Declaration of Human Rights and how, in his view, Cuba was in violation of its
17 years.
17 years. So when I met him, again, just to like sort of make clear, that, whether it's not as similar to this or that, it's not just a repressive thing in the sense of like, this soft political whatever. This guy, Antunes, starts to show me, he like lifts his shirt, lowers a bit his waistband, lifts his pant leg a bit, and he starts to show me all of the scars all over his body from the bite marks from when, over the course of 17 years, these people were sicking dogs on him. And what he tells me they would tell him, because this guy he is black as night. He is one of the darkest men on the planet, which is relevant because he tells me they would tell him this was the consequence of not being more grateful to Fidel Castro for what he'd done for black people in Cuba. So this is like, I'm 37 years old. This is in my lifetime. This is a dude who today is in Miami with his little girl because he can't be in his country because that's what it is to be. He did his, he put his grain of sand in this bucket. He contributed more than anybody could be asked to contribute. And there's people there now contributing in the way that he did. And some of their stories we'll never hear. Some of them are dead. Some of them will be dead soon. Some of them are young girls who are serving prison sentences. This is a real thing. So, are things better necessarily? I mean, maybe in some respects things are better. I don't know how much I could give credit to Obama or anybody else's policies. It's just, sometimes it's tough to see that things are on net better.
Yeah.
And I'm in contact with some people in Cuba, and they'll tell you like the scarcity situation is real, and it's one thing to debate whether it's attributable to certain trade policies of the U.S. or whatever else. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about a country where people, are you still got baseball players defecting. Like you got people, and to defect is not just to decide you want to leave. It's that it is an island prison. They will not let you leave. To defect is it's not to emigrate, it's to escape. Otherwise they just get on planes and leave. But we're still in that situation, right? It's not just a voting with their feet, it's that you have to break out. And that's still what we're dealing with today. So it's just tough to say, that things are on net better. There might be like isolated things, like of course it's better to have more access to information than less, but I don't know that I think it was really more a calculation of the Cuban government recognizing that there was no isolating the Cuban people from the internet forever, especially given how dependent they are on tourism and the fact that some number of Cubans was going to have contact with people from the outside world.
Right. Yeah, there's only so much containment that you can control over time as society continues to develop, even though they've managed to stay kind of in a time vortex of 1950s for as long as they have and stuff.
Right.
Okay. Well, I promise we're gonna have some fun here, Nick. There's some fun sticks, but again, thank you so much. And I consider you an expert on the topic. And I think it's an important line of discussion to bring up, and so I appreciate it. All the perspective that you bring to it. So this next segment is Everybody Eats, sponsored by Postano Cigars. If you always make sure that your serving style is bigger than your appetite, everybody will always get theirs. Postano Cigars is more than just great cigars made by cool people. They embody an attitude of gratitude and grit. With Postano, everybody eats. So Nick, this next segment is about food, obviously, and so we have a series of questions. The one I just pick at random for each guest each week. So here's one we haven't asked in a while. What is a food or dish that you love that you wouldn't have tried otherwise if you had not been offered to or forced to by someone else?
Interesting. Give me just a moment. My initial, I would say I like foie gras, but it's the first one that comes to mind because I wouldn't say I'm the most adventurous eater, but I wouldn't say that I'm like, averse to trying new things. So maybe foie gras, just because I probably would not have gone out of my way to spend what you typically have to spend on foie gras. I probably would have played a little safer with my money and gotten things that I knew I liked. And the odds that I ever would have made foie gras at home are slim to none. So that's a thing that, because I have this relationship that I do with this company, I've eaten more foie in the last several years than I had that I might otherwise have in my entire life.
I love foie gras. Holy cow. Yeah. It's fantastic.
So at Ariete, the signature thing for a long time has been a foie dish where I don't know if you're a fan of sweet plantains, but it's seared foie gras with a sweet plantain pave, right? So very thin sliced sweet pave stacked, and then it's got a sort of like temptation caramel is what they call it, drizzled over the whole thing. It's a good time. It's a very good time.
Sounds fantastic. I'm down for that.
Awesome. Yeah.
Delicious, man. Sounds good. All right. Our next segment is brought to you by Asylum Cigars. Refuge is more than just a physical place. It can be a state of mind. Some of life's greatest reflections can be found in our own personal asylum. Moments like these were made for Asylum Cigars. So light up an asylum and choose your refuge. Now, Nick, this segment talks about, again, we've talked a lot about the lounge that you're a part of, and our time even getting to know each other was built in a very community setting. Cigars are very community based. Oftentimes, more than likely than not, a majority of our cigar smoking is around other people. It's just the nature of them. It's what's probably one of the most endearing things about the industry in general, anyway. But every so often, we have the opportunity to smoke alone. And sometimes it's just a simple, what I just described earlier in the read. It's just a moment of reflection. Sometimes it's a celebration of something, but it's a more often than not, when if we get the opportunity to sit down and smoke a cigar by ourselves without anybody else, it's memorable for one reason or another. So you probably had several of these in your lifetime. But just grab one that comes to mind. Tell us what that moment was about, and if you can remember what you were smoking.
So the question is a memorable cigar.
A memorable cigar where you were smoking alone.
Where I was smoking alone. The first one that comes to mind, I was at the University of Missouri, and it was my first winter living in Missouri. And I was walking around the University of Missouri campus with a cigar. And it's memorable because it was the first time that it had really that I had felt my fingers, that I realized how bad an idea was to just like recreationally walk around in the cold. Because when I went to ash my cigar, I realized I had zero finger control and I could not bring my index finger down to tap my cigar. And
oh my God.
That feeling of just realizing I'm no longer in control of my fingers has never left my mind. I will never forget that feeling of looking at my hand and realizing there's just whatever connection should exist between my brain and my finger is not there, and I can't ash my cigar.
That's insane. Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Oh, I've been cold. I've smoked a cigar in what I would consider bitter cold conditions.
Yeah.
Never have I ever had the inability to move digits.
it was also just me being an idiot Miamian, like not realizing. Oh, most people would realize. Oh, okay, yeah, of course that's what's going to happen if you're walking around gloveless for this much time in the cold. But I was dumb, and that's what happened. So that's the first one that comes to mind. I don't do a lot of smoking alone, to be honest with you.
Most people don't. Well,
yeah,
that's why I think it's a unique question.
Yeah, if I'm smoking alone, usually I'm just getting worked on my computer on my front porch, but it's not usually that interesting a situation. Most of my away from home smoking is with somebody.
Do you, whether it's with Cigar Snob or not, do you do most of your writing with a cigar?
No. I'll do other work. I'll do other work with a cigar only because I find that it'll just go out too much. If I'm smoking a cigar, I've got to be if I'm working with a cigar, it's the more mindless stuff. Like, for example, if I'm reviewing podcast footage and I've only got to pause occasionally if I see something wrong, or maybe I'm reading something for research purposes. But if my hands are engaged in writing, I don't like having to come back to the cigar.
Got it.
It's I'm not a good multitasker in that sense.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. What do you remember what cigar it was that you froze your ass off with in that first winter?
Oh man, it was, if I had to guess, I would say it was a Padron. And the reason I would guess that is not just that I was smoking a lot of them at the time, but the first time that I was ever rewarded with some sort of good of value for a thing I had written. At the time I had a blog that I was keeping, and I wrote a post about like the, call it, emotional and personal significance of cigars as a way of connecting to Cubanness when I was so far from it in Miami, because I was being in Missouri. And somehow or another, this made it to the Padrones, and they sent me a box of, it might have been 3,000s signed. So, and I'm pretty sure I was living on campus, and I smoked, one of those a week. So I wasn't smoking every day when I was in college, but more than likely it was a Padron, maybe from that box.
Nice. Fantastic. Well, Nick, this is the end of our evening. We have one last question, of course.
All right.
And that, of course, is our Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust curveball questions. Fastballs or curveballs, it doesn't matter since the company's inception. Steve Saka has been knocking them out of the park. Count them up, 9 consecutive years in the consensus top 3. Congratulations to our good friend, Mr. Steve Saka. Before this curveball question, though, Nick, I'm just going to be asking: are you going to be? Will you be attending PCA trade show this coming month, upcoming month?
I won't. No. We have a pretty clear idea of what the expansion of our selection is going to look like, and I think if we're investing in travel right now, it's probably, remember, I'm the only one in the company who has had this experience, so I'm more interested in putting our resources and taking whatever free time I can wrangle from these guys to getting them to either Esteli or the DR to visit some of these factories and farms. And they've never had that experience. I don't know that we would, at this exact moment, get enough of a return on the trip to Vegas for that.
Well, hopefully it'll be a little closer next year. It'll be in New Orleans, so hopefully maybe you guys can convince the guys down there. And I think,
New Orleans is a danger. I remember the last time I was in New Orleans for a trade show. That's a dangerous town to get all the cigar industry guys together.
Yeah, I'll say. Plus, that convention center I hear is like walking a marathon from one side to the other.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to over the next 12 months or so to help lose some more LBs and get some really good walking shoes.
Just Vegas keeps everyone contained, to places where, but New Orleans means that you get how you get, and then you're let loose onto the streets to find your way back to. You got to move through a city after all of that.
Absolutely. All right. So here's my curveball question for you, Nick. So let's fast forward to a time. But let's, keep it relevant, maybe not necessarily your golden years, but to a time where you're still a relatively young enough person to where it may or may not make sense, depending on how you answer this question. But let's say things in Cuba change, right?
Right.
And they change for the better. They changed exactly how you and a lot of the activists and activist groups that you've been involved in, change. So that means free elections, and a lot of, a lot of more civil rights are granted back to people. Political prisoners are freed. No more political imprisonments. The whole 9 yards, right? I'm not saying a democracy is put in place or anything like that, but everything that you've been fighting for and activating for your entire adult life, and many people have for their entire lives, like we said, generations and decades upon decades, is achieved. Would you ever consider moving back? Would you ever consider moving to Cuba because you've never lived there?
Would I ever? Yeah, I wouldn't write it off. The only reason that I'm hesitating is that I like being in Miami a lot. But it's also close enough that, could I conceive of splitting my time, or if some opportunity came up, could I go there? Could I imagine moving there? I also wouldn't be that far from Miami, so it's like I might as well be in Orlando or something. Yeah, I wouldn't be out of hand completely opposed to that under those circumstances.
Yeah. Interesting. Is there a place in the world you would move to, since even though you love Miami so much?
Yeah, I would say I'm not more interested in living anywhere than I am in being in Miami. I would say, actually, funny that we just brought it up, I have said I have said it often, if I had to be somewhere other than Miami, New Orleans would probably be in the next
Interesting
spot of preference. Yeah.
What do you love about New Orleans so much?
I love that it's the only city in the US with a culture that's completely its own. It's not where like you go to New York or LA or even Miami, and to the extent that they're they're culturally rich, it's drawing from different places, right? It's like more of a stew than
it's a melting pot. Yeah. Or a stew. I like that metaphor.
Because that makes sense. Because you've got these on, like you go to New York and you've got great pizza, and you've got great
Yeah, Little
Chinese,
Italy and Chinatown. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, and in the arts, you've got things from here, things. You go to New Orleans, and New Orleans is a place where, of course, it didn't just spring out of nothing, but New Orleans is a place where things melted into each other and outsprang this thing you will not find anywhere else, right? And most people's favorite things about New York are things that New York does that come from someplace else, and you can draw a pretty direct line.
Mm.
New Orleans is not a collection of things from other places or a copy of something or even a thing that other people are capable of copying. New Orleans is uniquely New Orleans. And I love that about it. I also like and I'm not somebody who puts, I don't need to be, I'm not, I don't live in an urban area. I don't need to be like an urbanite, but I do love the feeling of walking through New Orleans. And we've been talking about Cuba all this time. The last time I was in New Orleans, it's been a long time. I think the last time I was there, I was with Andy Astencio again, the Cigar Snob art director, and he mentioned, and I agree, New Orleans is the closest thing in the U.S. to walking through Old Havana.
Well, that's a
It's
unique comparison.
just in the sense that, like, you walk around, like, where is there left in the U.S. that you walk through the streets of a legit city and there's life in the street and there's people doing stuff on stoops, but it's still like it's a low to the ground old city, you know. It just aesthetically, culturally, the life on the street, the way people interact with each other, it is the thing that has reminded me the most of, reminded me the most of what little time I was in Havana, and from what he told me, at least at the time, reminded him the most of his time living in Havana.
That's awesome.
And also the food. I mean, I like to eat, and I mean, it's tough to beat food in New Orleans.
That's awesome. Well, I hope to see you next year at that trade show. I think that would be a really cool perspective to have Mike and members of the group to come down and experience that. But I think, man, if you could ever, we'll talk a little bit offline. I have a couple of ideas for you for a couple of people. I know you have great connections, but just some really great learning experiences that they could benefit from. If you want to take them down to in country a little bit.
Sure,
so.
dude.
Well, fantastic. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and our audience for staying up late with us as always. It was just so good catching up with you, man, and then so exciting to have you back. Um, I say this often, when people leave and then they come back, I'm like, I always tell them, it seems like a tired compliment, but I'm like, the industry's better with you back, man. It really is.
Oh, man.
With good people. There's always just the industry's better with good people who are, incredibly smart, insightful and caring to this industry, and I know you care about it, so it's great to have you back, and
I appreciate that. I appreciate that, and I'll before we close here, I want to make sure that I take an opportunity. I was actually talking with Reinhard, who said hello to you before we started recording the thing or streaming it. Like, the thing you're doing is super cool, man. The thing you're doing and you've been doing for a while, I'm like continually impressed by, it's crazy that I'm on this thing at all, because I see this who's who of cigar people, and I think it's the fact that your guest list, that the roster of past guests is what it is a testament to how much people value you here, and how much trust you've earned in the business, because people are giving you, people whose time is way more valuable than mine. A lot of them are giving a lot of that time to you, and I think that that's a huge testament, to the fact that, like, people see what you're doing and they really value it, and the stuff that you're good at this, and people are right to trust you with their time.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very kind, Nick. Yeah, no, I can't believe this is our 282nd take, man, and it's unbelievable that I've done 282 of these, and later this year we'll hit 300, and that's just insane to me.
Crazy.
Just insane. Just unbelievable. And like you said, the people that I've had the opportunity, my 200th take was Carlito Fuente. My
That's cool.
250th take was Nick Perdomo. My 100th take was Pete Johnson. Pete's been on several times now, but that was at the time when I was on my way to 100 takes. It was it was really, I wanted Pete, and I was like, I really want you for this show. And he's like, yeah, of course I'll do it. And I was like, oh, thank God. And that was the first time. I still reflect on this. It was really great. At the time, it was a freaking nightmare. It was the first time my internet had ever gone down during the middle of a show. And Pete, to his credit, man, just hung in there. Because Zoom's really great. It doesn't kick the show off. It was still going live streaming on Facebook. And so like people were just like lambasting him with questions, and he was just sitting there answering them and everything like that. And I was finally able to get back on. And for my 100th take, it was supposed to be so special. It's definitely memorable. It definitely wasn't my best just because of the technical snafu that I had. But it was a calamity of memorable proportion. Let's just put it that way. But it was nice. It was nice nonetheless. So, but thank you for the kind words, and I look forward to seeing all the things that you do with El Vecino and beyond that. So I'm really excited for that. So for everyone out there, again, we really do appreciate our audience. Thanks for tuning in and staying up late with us as always. You can always check us out every Sunday night at 9:30 Central on our Facebook Live page, which is where we're broadcasting now, Alosa Fumar. You can always check out our YouTube channel as well, Alosa Fumar. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. But if you're listening to us later, wherever you happen to listen to podcasts, whether that be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Podbean, or wherever you listen to podcasts, including iHeartRadio, don't forget to download, subscribe, and review. If you are a subscriber, do me a favor, hit unsubscribe, but don't forget to hit resubscribe because that really helps my numbers. And if you think I suck, like the guy who gave me a 1-star on Apple Podcasts, it'd be really helpful if you tell me why. That way I can actually learn something from it other than you just thinking I'm suck, that I'm suck and I'm terrible. So, and as I butcher the English language here at the end of the night there, but that would be great. Feedback is fantastic. I would love it. So, that being said, we do really appreciate everyone as always. And this, we had mentioned just before, this was our 282nd take. Can't believe I've done 282 of these. We're on the road to 300. I'm Bear Duplessis as always, live from the Alec Bradley Lone Star studio of Azle, Texas. He's Nick Jimenez. Guess what, everybody? See you next time.